In this lecture, we're going to compare and contrast the advantages and disadvantages of getting different kinds of sources or perspectives on rating performance. So just to start out, who do you think should be the best, the most accurate source of performance information? Alright, that kind of wasn't fair. The answer is really none of the above. What we've learned is that all of these different sources each have a unique perspective on performance, and they all have some particular advantages and disadvantages. But again, just like with rating formats, no one rating source wins in terms of who's going to be the most accurate. So let's talk first about supervisor ratings. Those are by far the most common. Supervisors are the primary or sole rating source for 90% of performance appraisals. This has some advantages. The supervisor presumably knows what the employee is supposed to be doing, hopefully has a reasonable opportunity to observe the employee, but it does raise some concerns. One big concern from a measurement quality perspective is that if each employee has only one supervisor who does their ratings, we don't know anything about the reliability of those ratings. We don't know to the extent to which those ratings might be different if we had had the employee rated by a different supervisor. It's hard to evaluate. Is a particular supervisor lenient? Are they particularly harsh? Are they being fair or not? There's no good way to tease out how accurate those ratings are or how much they might be influenced by something about the supervisor, not by the employee. We also have the concern that any given supervisor doesn't necessarily observe 100% of an employee's performance. So their observations, their assessment of performance is based on what the employee does when the supervisor is watching, which may not necessarily represent the employee's typical performance or the way they perform when the supervisor is not there watching. It's often been argued that peer ratings are a good way to get around that limitation. When we have peer ratings, peers probably see more of an employee's typical day-to-day performance than a supervisor does in most jobs. They see what the employee is like when the boss is not there directly watching. Because we have multiple peers usually, we can also compare peer ratings to one another. We can see how reliable they are, we can see how well they agree. And we do find that at least when the peers are fairly well acquainted with the person being rated, they tend to be fairly reliable. In very large organizations, there are sometimes problems when people are asked to rate peers that they don't work with very often. If you have, say, a large retail store, and you tend to work with the same 2 or 3 people, but there are 15 other people with your same job title, you're going to rate those people you know well pretty accurately, but it's going to be much harder to rate those people that you only occasionally work with. We do also find that peer ratings are fairly well correlated, all things considered, with supervisors' ratings. This raises some interesting questions, though, about whether peer ratings are really adding new information. If they're highly correlated, does that mean that they're not really telling us anything that the supervisor didn't already know? A couple of other things that we find are interesting about peer ratings. The quality of the ratings depends a little bit on who exactly is doing that rating. Good employees tend to be stricter raters than poor employees. And this aligns very nicely with some of the job analysis research. Good employees have a different understanding of what the job is. Poor employees might think that everybody around them is great because they don't fully understand what they're supposed to be doing. Maybe that's why they're a poor employee, and so they perceive everybody else as being better. A good employee has a more complex, more sophisticated understanding of what that job should involve, and so they tend to be stricter, they tend to see more flaws in other people's performance. Another thing that we find about peer ratings is that negative peer feedback tends to produce stronger negative reactions from the person being rated compared to negative feedback from other sources. That is, your supervisor might evaluate you negatively, and you're probably not going to like that, but you're not going to take it as hard as you will negative evaluations from your peers or for your coworkers. When the person that we're evaluating is a manager, there's an argument that we should get evaluations of their performance from the people they manage. The term you'll see sometimes in the literature for this is upward feedback or upward appraisal. The argument for it is that the effectiveness of a leader depends to a considerable extent on how willing people are to follow them. It's very easy for a supervisor to maybe engage in behaviors that look good to people above them, but that might have a negative impact on the people that they're directly managing. So the idea is that the people a supervisor supervises have a unique and a really important perspective on their management style and their leadership behavior. What the research suggests, though, is that these kinds of ratings are really unpopular with the subordinates. Subordinates typically don't feel free to be honest in these ratings. There are lots and lots of concerns about identification or being retaliated against. Even if the boss doesn't know that it was me that gave that negative rating, he's going to know that somebody gave it, and he's going to treat us all badly as a result. It also turns out that these ratings do tend to be pretty highly correlated with upper management ratings. So again, it raises that question of, well, are they really telling us anything we wouldn't have known from another source? We also find ratings from subordinates are much more effective when they're used for development than for decision making. And that's related to these concerns about identification and retaliation. If I'm told that my boss really truly wants to know what she could be doing better, I might be more inclined to tell her so honestly than if I'm asked to give an appraisal that's going to affect her chances for promotion or for a raise. I might be much more concerned about retaliation in those kinds of scenarios. Hang on to this idea about subordinate ratings being more effective for development than for decision making. We'll talk about that a little bit more actually in the next lecture. When subordinate ratings are used for development, there's some research that suggests that they are more effective than ratings from other sources at getting people actually to change. So you might want to think just a little bit about why that might be. What is it about input from the people you manage that would be more influential in getting you to change your behavior than feedback, say, from your boss or from your peers in the organization? Some organizations will also solicit customer feedback and use that in the appraisal process. They might do this very formally, they might do it more informally. Some organizations just kind of keep a running total of, these are the times I heard compliments about this person or complaints about this person. A more formal technique might be customer surveys or the evaluation cards that you used to see in lots of retail stores and restaurants. Some organizations do this very formally in the form of secret shoppers, or people who go in pretending to be a customer or maybe actually being a customer, but also keeping track of someone's service performance. That would probably be the most formal form of a customer rating. Customer ratings don't always agree very well with any other rating source. They tend to have a very different perspective. The thing that we know mostly about using customer data in performance appraisals is that it only works well if you're able to get a lot of customer data per employee. The challenge with customer ratings is that customers will typically only volunteer feedback when things are very, very good or very, very bad. If you think about it, when was the last time you asked to speak to a manager about an employee who had helped you? It was probably in a situation where things weren't so good, or in a situation where things were just really exceptional and outstanding. Nobody ever says, I'd like to speak to your manager, I want to tell them how average your performance was. That we just don't think to do that. And if we did, it would probably be interpreted very negatively by the manager. So customer ratings, customer input tends to be out at the extremes. Even when we're directly soliciting customer feedback, people are generally only inclined to complete those surveys, again, if they had a really good experience or a really bad experience, or if we offered them a really nice incentive. That does help a little bit, but we still don't tend to capture the typical day-to-day customer experience. So we don't want to place too much weight on that one customer who was really mean and angry, or that one customer who always makes a point of saying something really nice about every server's manager. We want to have a lot of data points so that we get the sense of, was this a one-time thing that this employee really did something good, or is that really their typical work style? Is that something that's normal for them? And then finally, the last rating source we might consider is the employee themselves. We might ask employees to take part in their own performance appraisal. Now, the first problem with self-ratings is exactly what you'd expect. Employees tend to rate themselves pretty positively. They tend to score on the high end of the scale. Most people don't rate themselves as performing below expectations or recommend themselves for lots of development. They also tend to correlate much more poorly with other rating sources. So we said earlier, supervisor ratings and peer ratings and subordinate ratings tend to be moderately well aligned. Self-ratings don't tend to be well aligned with any of those. And they also don't tend to correlate very well with objective performance measures. So if you have, for example, measures of average call time, and you ask people to self-report their average call time, they're not very accurate in that. We can improve the alignment of self-ratings with others by giving things like very clear standards. If you use something like a behaviorally anchored scale, you do tend to get more agreement between self-ratings and other kinds of ratings. Another challenge that comes in when we use self-ratings is that when people rate themselves, that gives them a really clear vision of where they are misaligned with other people. We said earlier, people respond really negatively to negative feedback from peers. This is magnified even further when it's clear that there's a disconnect between their view of their own performance and their peers' view of their performance. Those tend to elicit really negative emotional reactions. As with other things, self-ratings tend to be most effective when the appraisal is being used for development. If you ask people, do they deserve a raise, they're all going to tell you yes. If you ask people what would they like to get better on, they tend to be a little more honest, and so those ratings tend to be a little more useful in that context. There's also some interesting research on cultural differences. Your textbook talks a little bit about how the whole system of performance appraisal really stems from a Western cultural perspective. In other societies that value the group above the individual, or that place a very high value on modesty and humility, people may rate themselves in ways that the organization doesn't necessarily expect. So there's still a lot of question marks surrounding how exactly culture influences self-ratings of performance, but there are enough of them that it makes us think we really need to be cautious in how we use these. We need to think very carefully about it. In our next lecture, we will talk about what happens when we try to get the best of all possible worlds. Is it more effective, is it more useful to get ratings from all of these sources and put them together in what we call multi-source appraisal or 360-degree performance appraisal?